Hello, I'm very conscious about not saying the word folks. Hello, people. It's Thursday evening. I hope you're well. So what's been going on for you? I wonder how you're feeling at the moment, how you're coping with lockdown. Maybe you're not working, maybe you haven't been working for a while. The news is saying that it could be a long while before many of us get back to normality, whatever that may be for you and whatever that may look like. We don't really know yet. So yeah, lots of uncertainty, and I wonder how you're coping with that. So let me know, and also as we go through this evening, if you'd like to submit any comments, please do so, and questions as well. Let us know you're watching, let us know who you are, and yeah, we've got Alice with us today, Alice Lyons. She is the founder of wellbeing company Dark Coffee, and that's all about expanding conversations around mental health and also supporting other people in the wellbeing space. And yeah, it kind of started out with Alice's own personal journey around mental health and suicidal ideation. So a bit of a trigger warning if you're feeling delicate or have any issues yourself around suicidal ideation. I would just keep yourself safe. And also, if you have any young impressionable ears, you know, it is part of life, it's normal, but if you want to make sure you've got headphones in, then please go ahead and do so. So I shall bring Alice into the studio and we will have our chat. And like I say, do get involved, let us know who's watching, give us some questions and stuff like that. So hello, Alice, and welcome.
Hi, that was a lovely intro, thanks for that.
Yeah, you're welcome. So how are you today?
I'm feeling good. We had a little chat before we came on, and I was saying, like, I honestly couldn't tell you what I've done today. It's just been not quite a whirlwind of Zoom calls, but there've been a lot back to back, and I've just got that real Zoom fatigue today. So feeling a little bit spaced out, but generally good. I just came back from quite a long walk around. There's a nature reserve down at the end of my road in Chorlton, so I went for a nice long walk around there, put a podcast on, just kind of chilled out for a bit. So that was really nice. I feel like I've recalibrated myself for the evening, which is nice.
Good stuff. Yeah. Is that Chorlton Water Park you've been walking around?
Yeah, Chorlton. I go into Chorlton Ease, and then I can either go left to Chorlton Water Park or right to Sale Water Park. So I live near a Sale. So I do most of my evening runs. I'll go around there. But I'm mixing it up with a walk today.
Yeah, good stuff. So how are you coping with lockdown generally and these new ways of doing it?
Probably not very well. It's do you know what? It's the most interesting, like, collective experience I think we could ever go through. It's just the scale of it, the enormity of it is phenomenal, and my mood's going up and down all the time, every day. It's part of the work that I do is talking about my own mental health and how I manage it and how I mitigate it and stuff. And then this is like a whole nother layer of complexity on top of it. So it's been super interesting. But this week I've been managing really well, I think. Last week was awful. Last week was the lowest I've felt in a really long time, actually, probably a few months. And it was kind of growing from week one of lockdown. I felt actually quite good and quite okay. I was like, okay, this is a crisis, okay. But I'm one of those when there's a crisis and everyone's panicking, I'm quite calm. And then I panic when everybody else is calm. So my immediate response was like, okay, this is happening. I can't control the situation. I can't control the enormity. All I can do is focus on myself, make sure everybody else is okay, do what I can, So I kind of went into action and problem solving mode very early on. And then for me, it's been the biggest challenge for me has been the social side of it. So not being able to see my friends, not being able to go to networking events, which I'm very used to, not being able to shake hands with people, not being able to make conversation with people in the supermarket, stuff like that. There are little things going on, but just the scale of social interaction that I'm used to, that's the thing that's really been upsetting more than anything. It's been absolutely, it feels like I'm going through a breakup or something. There's an element of sort of heartbreak to it for me. So that's been one of the biggest challenges so far.
Yeah, totally hear you. It's a sense of grief, I think, because I think we're all grieving for many of the aspects of what we would consider normal life that we just can't do anymore. And there doesn't seem to be any closure around it either, because we don't know how. And it's hard to navigate. So many people are saying that, similar to you, they're up and down, not a lot of rhyme on it. So do you find yourself there's certain triggers that during this pandemic, during the lockdown, certain triggers that make you feel worse, or is it just no rhyme or reason to it?
Sometimes it's a little bit unpredictable, but then when I really track it, because I do things like journaling, I do quite a lot of self-care practices, and when I really dig into it, I'm like, do you know what? It's not such a coincidence that my mood is terrible this week because my diet's been too high in sugar. I've had too much caffeine. I haven't been sleeping properly. In the beginning, I was doing, I'd upped my level of exercise compared to a regular week, so I wasn't doing like a walking commute. So I was very conscious to increase it, but I didn't increase it as much as I needed to make up for the fact that I'm more sedentary during the day. So all of these things kind of compounded together, and I was like, do you know what? It's also a very extreme and very stressful situation, and I'm quite empathic, so I kind of absorb the energy of people around me. And if the collective mood is down, that always impacts me as well. So with all these things on top of it, you know, I can absolutely justify why I've been feeling rubbish. But then at the same time, as we all know about our emotions and things, sometimes they are just random, and some days you'll just cry out of nowhere for no reason. Like the situation hasn't changed from one day to the next necessarily, but just your reaction to it differs ever so slightly.
Yeah, that's it. That's the human experience, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Just have to try and navigate it as best you can. And I suppose the self-care stuff that you're talking about there, get connected with you on Instagram recently, and we were talking about, you know, what you're struggling with and the sort of things that you can do, the interventions that you personally are aware of, and running is one of those. And you just talked about caffeine as perhaps being coping mechanisms which aren't so healthy, but they are coping mechanisms all the same.
Definitely. Yeah, and caffeine is one that I have to be really careful of, because obviously, you know, dark coffee being the company name, like I've been into it for a few years, and my early career was in coffee shops, which is partly where the name came from. So coffee has very much been, it's been a passion of mine, as much as for me, it's not one of those things like I need coffee. I don't ever tell myself that, but for me, it's a real source of pleasure. I really enjoy coffee. I'm a bit of a snob around it, to be honest. But I've had to be really careful of that, because as much as you use it for enjoyment, not everything that you enjoy is good for you. It's the same as if I sat for 8 hours and did a Netflix binge. Part of me would enjoy it, but part of me really wouldn't. So we've got to, I think all of us are kind of parenting ourselves quite a lot at the moment. We're learning so much about ourselves every day. A lot of people have learned a lot about their working patterns and their working rhythms, and where their energy comes from and what drains them, and when they're most productive in the day. A lot of people are talking about productivity. I was just talking with my housemate about it before, actually, and he was saying, I'm just not getting any work done in the morning, so I'm having to work longer into the evening. And I said, why don't you just start work 3 hours later? And he said, oh, I never thought to do that. And it's just because we're so used to our ways, sometimes we're really stuck in them. And it's such a simple solution. He said he felt a bit guilty not working those 3 hours in the morning. I was like, but you're still doing the same amount of work, and you're going to be doing better quality work for blocking it in when you have the most energy and the most attention for it. So you're opting out of one style of work. Like, there's no reason 9 till 5 should suit you. There's just a arbitrary figure that someone came up with once upon a time, but it doesn't work for everybody. So it's a real opportunity to kind of learn about yourself and your body and your mind. There's all sorts of interesting observations we can be making about ourselves right now.
Yeah, totally agree. Reevaluating our lives, potentially, the opportunities there. And really like that phrase that you said there, Alice, about we're parenting ourselves. We're kind of learning how to look after ourselves. And, you know, as a parent myself, I've got 2 children, one of whom is a teenager. And,
good luck. I love teenagers. I think it's a fascinating age, isn't it? They're so interesting when they start having like all their own thoughts, and they kind of develop that new sense of kind of individuality, and they're trying to figure out things for themselves. It's such an interesting age.
It is, yeah, and interesting. I had a lecture about adolescence at college last night, so I learned a little bit more there. But
oh, cool.
But yeah, what I was going to get to there was around schooling, because my children, and I think most children, are being sent work by their schools. But teenagers, their circadian rhythm, their sleep rhythm changes as the hormones change and all that type of stuff. So yeah, my daughter is, I suppose, fairly typical in that she doesn't really do early mornings, and she's much more of a night owl. So we just thought we'll change that. And she's parenting herself. She's getting up later. And later, so it just fits in with her rhythm. So,
and that's good to kind of allow that, and not try to over structure things that don't need to be over structured. I think we all have this kind of guilt complex sometimes about, well, I'm not doing an 8-hour work day. And I think it's something that took me a while to shake off, you know, running my own business. I realized I can choose my own hours now. I'm not having to answer to anybody else. So But it took me a while to shake off the guilt of like, oh, I haven't worked 8 hours today. It's like, no one's telling you have to. Like, it's getting me to challenge all these preconceptions that I used to have. But it's only through years of being trained into that model of thinking. It's only because we've gone to school and we've been told you start work at this time, you finish work at this time of day. We've just been socialized in that direction. It's not natural at all. So it's good that you're kind of embracing the freedom to kind of explore it a little bit and change it around and see what works for you.
Yeah, absolutely. So yes, you started your own business, so we'll get onto that shortly. I suppose, do you want to give us more of a background around your own mental health and personal journey, Alice, and what led to the founding of Dark Coffee?
Yeah, sure. So my sort of mental health background is I went through a really difficult period in my late adolescence. I say it started around 18, 19. And then throughout my 20s, I had real problems with depression, and it led through to suicide ideation, which is anything to do with the thoughts and feelings around suicide. So I never made any attempts whatsoever, but it would be a recurring kind of thing where I'd have, especially suicidal fantasies was something I used for escapism. So when I was really, really stressed, especially when I went into work, it got particularly stressful because I had quite a level of responsibility. I was a young manager in a coffee shop, and it was, very, very long hours, very, very low pay, lots of expectations, not a lot of support. And these things kind of combined just made me feel massively out of my depth. And I kind of reached the point of burnout when I was about 25, and I needed to be signed off work for medical reasons because I had a physical condition. But on reflection, I completely believe it was like my body's manifestation of the stress I'd been feeling and not dealing with very well at all. So it kind of culminated in me having to have an operation, and it was during the recovery phase that I suddenly kind of stood back for the first time and actually looked at my life properly and was like, I'm just not happy. I'm really not happy with any of this. And I couldn't really put my finger on what specifically was, like, if there was a root cause, but it was just generally, I just had a general malaise around everything. So my poor boyfriend at the time, I dumped him, and I started looking at my job and thinking, like, am I happy with my job? No. What do I want to do? I want to change it. So it kind of started this process which went on for like the next 6 years of sort of self-development and personal inquiry and learning more about myself and what makes me tick, and trying to just find how to be happy, really, because I realized I wasn't truly happy. I had superficial levels of happiness, but I didn't have, I guess, fulfillment is the thing that I've learned the most over the last 6 years. And that's something that's not taught in school, and is unless you have very, very good leaders and very good support from the company that you work for, it's not really something that we're ever taught in our jobs. Job fulfillment, we talk about work satisfaction sometimes, but not how to feel truly, like your best version of yourself, and you're living up to your potential and all these things. And those things are important to me. So yeah, it went from being in a very, very dark place and not knowing where it came from or how to look after it, how to look after myself. During the period when I was signed off work, I got really into TED Talks. And for me, TED Talks were an absolute revelation, really, because I'd always read things like business books, and I've always read, personal biographies and things and inspirational stories. But it was only when I watched, I think it was because they're so short, and I watched a lot back to back, and I saw a kind of formula that the speakers had. And it was very much lifestyle, something not quite right, down, reach a rock bottom point. A lot of them had suicide ideation. A lot of them spoke about making suicide attempts very, 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 very common in very high achieving people. Super interesting. But they all describe this kind of rock bottom point usually, and that's the kind of catalyst for change. That's what makes them reevaluate and then come back out and go on to beautiful and great things. I just found it so inspirational and so interesting. And it was probably not until that point that I'd kind of realized I'd had suicidal feelings. I would never have labeled it as that, because like I say, they kind of came up for me as little fantasies where I'd sort of be imagining, I'm not going to get too graphic or anything, but I would just kind of find myself musing on the bus stop waiting for my bus home. I'd just be like looking at the top of a building and just be like, oh God, if I just jumped off of the top of there right now, like all my problems would be solved. And it had like a physical kind of feeling in my body, like I'd feel immediate relief and I'd feel calmer at this thought. So for me, it was almost like self-care rather than self-destruction. And suicide's got a very bad PR at the moment. Obviously, like, it's not a pleasant topic and nobody wants to think about it. But actually, if we start thinking about suicide ideation especially earlier on in the process, and how it actually feels, and what other feelings attribute to it and what it means, we can actually talk about it more openly and bring a bit more compassion and a bit more curiosity to the subject. Because I until I watched TED Talks, I had never heard the phrase suicide ideation, and I'd never really seen anyone talk about it so publicly and so kind of casually as well. They just kind of dropped it in like, oh, and then I had feelings of suicide, but then I came back out of it and I was just like, it was honestly a revelation to me. So yeah, so that's kind of what led me to personal development and kind of working on myself and self-care and all these things. Like mental health wasn't even on my remit, to be honest. Like I knew I had depression, but I didn't really know about the whole mental health picture. I didn't know how much it affected every one of us, not just me. There's, you know, all of us navigate our mental health and the spectrum of mental health. Yeah, very very long-winded explanation there.
It's all good. It's all good. So, you know, I think part of the reason that you do what I do, you do what you do, and I do what I do, is to raise awareness and reduce stigma around mental health issues. So, yeah, there is a massive stigma around the topic of suicide and the language that we use around it. And,
Sure.
One of my hats is a mental health first aid instructor, and talk about suicide. It's a difficult subject, and a lot of people are touched by it because they know someone who has taken their own life. And just one of the many things we talk about is the language that we use, and we try to avoid commit suicide because that's
definitely
crime, and use language like take your own life. And we also talk about how common it is. So are you aware of any stats around that, Alice, around how many people have ideation, how many people attempt suicide?
Ideation is a really interesting one because it's I can't remember where I got this, whether it was Mind or the World Health Organization, but they say it's as many as 1 in 5 adults in the UK experience ideation, which is 13 million people. Which, when you think about it, you know, how many friends do you have? Say you got 20 friends. That's like, you know, a sizable number of your friends. That's 4 people out of all of your friends who have ideation. But I'd argue it's more than that because it's a really hard thing to, like I say, people don't really understand what it means. They haven't really heard the phrase. So, and also, like, I wouldn't admit for ages that I'd had feelings of suicide and I was having these fantasies and things like that. And a couple of times I got kind of closer to considering it, and I got further along the kind of contemplation stages. But I wouldn't have, you know, if you asked in a survey, have you experienced thoughts of suicide? I probably would have said no. So wherever they're getting ththese stats from, I think it needs to be evaluated further, because I have a lot of conversations with people about this, obviously, and it's more common than that. And it could just be the circles I run in. I don't know, but I don't think that is the case, because I you know, I go to a lot of networking events and I go to a lot of things where it's not just my immediate circle of friends or anything. Like I'm integrating with lots of different communities, and there's always someone in every room that will talk to me about it. And it's so interesting. It doesn't discriminate against, I know it's kind of promoted as a men's issue, and the stats suggest that it's obviously a lot more younger men are taking their life, and that's the highest source of mortality. But you know, it affects everyone. It affects everyone so much. It affects young people. Like hundreds of children take their lives every year, hundreds, and it's awful. And one of the things that contributes to the number is that people are not able to, or they don't feel able to express themselves fully, and they don't feel like there's enough support out there. That was, you know, it's one of the many contributing factors. But yeah, you're right. It affects so many people, and if we don't necessarily feel suicidal ourselves, we definitely know someone who does or has done.
Yeah, that's right. So yeah, shocking statistics, and some that I've come to mind for me is that it's the biggest killer of men in their 40s.
Yeah,
and there are a lot of figures around men, and it is quite often seen as a men's issue, but I believe there are some stats out there that suggest that just as many females attempt suicide as males, but they just use less lethal means.
I think it's actually that more women make attempts, and it's certainly true in the States. More women make attempts, but you're right. The method that they tend to use, the possibility of intervention and medical intervention is a lot higher, because they tend to use less. They use like slower acting methods, like self-poisoning, things like that. Whereas men are more likely to go for, like in America, shootings are the most common, I think.
So yeah, and I think it's, you know, when we see percentages, if it's like 2% of people have attempted suicide, something like that, it's ridiculously high. But when you frame it with like you say, your group of friends, I think the average number of Facebook friends people have is about 400. So on that basis, you think about 8 of your Facebook friends have attempted suicide at some point.
Yeah.
Well, I'm only aware of, I think, two people in my network that I'm aware of. So there's a lot of people who just aren't talking about it.
Yeah, definitely.
Because of the stigma or shame?
Yeah, I think, you know, talking from my personal experience and the people that I've spoken to, shame is a huge one. That is one of the biggest challenges we come up against when we have any kind of mental health conversations. It's people don't want to be branded with this big horrible thing that seemed to be, you know, selfish. It seemed to be a very selfish act. And actually the way that I've come to understand it is sometimes it's just a desperate act of self-care in a moment when they don't know what else to do. They've tried other avenues, or, you know, sometimes it's not even like people are, well, a lot of the time people are not trying to take their life. They just want a bit of peace, and they just want a bit of quiet. And, you know, there's a lot of accidental suicides and all these things, but I think definitely in all the conversations that I have with people, shame comes up again and again and again. And because people don't want to kind of attach themselves to the word even, they don't want to admit, you know, how bad their thoughts have got. And also there's a real tendency to over dramatize it. And I know that might sound like a weird thing on the face of it, but if you think about the representation of suicide in the media, we're always talking about completed suicides, and we're talking about the death figures, and we're thinking about the man on the bridge. And if we see it in popular culture and films and stuff, it's always a very dramatic image of someone acting in a moment of passion. And that's not the experience for a lot of people. For a lot of people, it's you know, it's very calm and very quiet. Some people have planned it for a while and they're just very sort of resigned in their decision. But then I think I did the mental health first aid course as well, and they said 1 in 10 suicides is not related to mental health whatsoever. Sometimes it's almost like euthanasia, like someone's at an older age and they feel like they've done everything, they've lived their life, and they actually just, they're like, I'm happy with that, I'm done. And it's a very quiet and very calm, kind of very cathartic thing. So there's all sorts of different ranges and experiences in under the massive umbrella of suicide and ideation. And I think because we just have this very one extreme view that's ever promoted and it's ever represented even, that's one of the biggest challenges that we have. This is why I say it's like it's got a bad PR, because we don't know enough about it, and it's not being presented in the right kind of nuanced ways. And don't forget, like, humans are very incredibly complex, and one experience of suicide is going to be different from someone else's. So unless we're having these exploratory conversations and get a bit curious about it, it's not going to change. And it really, really needs to change. If anything needs to change, our perception of suicide needs to.
Yeah. So what you're doing, you know, you're facilitating a lot of those conversations and normalizing it as far as possible. And I suppose the other side of that is the individuals themselves who are having the suicidal ideation. It's about having some outlet where they can express their feelings, hopefully in a non-judgmental environment where they're not going to be made to feel that shame. So, yeah, and the other point I want to make before we get back to your personal story is around this idea that someone who is contemplating suicide, it isn't necessarily the case that they want to die completely. It's maybe quite often the case that a part of them wants to die, but there is usually a part that wants to stay alive. And that's your own experience because you're still here.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd say it's probably more the exception rather than the rule that people are looking to die. I don't really think many people want to. I think it's more a case of wanting to be away from pain that they don't know how to deal with. And again, like I say, it's that source of kind of relief. And, you know, if we're very stressed and we're very emotional, sometimes we just want it to stop. We just want a bit of headspace. And I know that's the experience of a lot of people who've gone for the slower acting methods. They haven't really been looking to die. Some people actually try to just become hospitalized, and that's kind of the intention behind it. They're like, I can't go on living like this, but I don't know what to do about it, but I don't know how to get out of all of these terrible situations or the stress that I'm feeling. So they kind of do something to get themselves hospitalized so that they just have a bit of breathing space, a bit of relief. But yeah, there's statistics to say that most people don't truly intend to die. And that's kind of proven by the fact that not everyone, if they make an attempt and they survive, not everybody goes on to reattempt. There is a certain rate of attempting again, but a lot of people don't. And that just shows, like, It was never, or if it was an intention in a moment, it doesn't have to be a permanent state. We don't have to live in that reality, because we're always moving through these cycles of emotions and feelings and stuff. And just because something feels true and it feels very real in a moment doesn't mean that moment's going to last forever. And even if you keep coming back to it and you keep revisiting it, that doesn't have to be your reality, and you don't have to believe that about yourself, and you don't have to stay there. And like, you know, there's so many people that are living proof of that, and that's why I really recommend TED Talks to people who want a bit of inspiration and stuff, because you have so many examples of people who've gone on to lead phenomenal lives. And you know, we're not all here to live a big flashy life and be top of our professions or anything at all, but I think the fact that those people have gone on to do that off of the back of, you know, suicide attempts and stuff just shows there's things to be gained from these experiences and all these emotions that we're going through, and how we deal with it. You can make it into a real, you know, learning experience. There's good to be found in everything.
There's always hope.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, and thoughts are just thoughts. So that kind of mindfulness aspect, that you don't have to believe your thoughts.
Yeah, definitely.
So getting back to your own personal journey, so you had all those mental health issues and the breakdown in your 20s. So how did you get from there to where you are today? Was it starting to talk about your own suicidal ideation and then setting up a business?
No, it wasn't as straightforward as that. It started really, really small. So like I say, it started with watching the TED Talks and kind of being struck by how similar their journeys were to mine, which became a lot more important to me later on. I'll explain when I get onto the podcast and stuff why that's important. But yeah, I sort of recognize myself in these people's stories, and I've always been a writer. I've kept journals for years, probably like 20 years or so. So I did a lot of kind of journaling and a lot of self-reflection. It got especially prevalent in this time that after my breakdown. I actually did a creative writing degree, so I did kind of do a lot of writing, but this is the first time that kind of switch the focus. So rather than just telling stories about things and looking outwards, I was sort of looking inwards and reflecting a lot more. So I did that. I did therapy as well. I had a really interesting therapist who, because I hadn't been diagnosed with depression, she didn't want to kind of touch on that too much. So we did a little bit of talking around it and how I felt and coping strategies and things, but it was more sort of focused towards work and my career. So she was quite a kind of business coach in the end. And we kind of focused on what I wanted to get out of work and how I could feel fulfillment. And she really helped me kind of make action plans and think a bit strategically as well, which I never had done before, which was really nice. So working with a coach definitely helped. And it was an interesting experience actually with the therapist, because she got me to sign a disclaimer at the beginning. And this is again why I talk about the language that we use around suicide and kind of our perception of it. She got me to sign this disclaimer that said, if you talk about any kind of suicidal feelings, or I get the impression that you have to that you might harm yourself or anything like that, I'm going to break confidentiality and I need to talk to the relevant authorities and refer you on. And it just seemed like this one document escalated my situation so much that I then didn't feel comfortable talking to her about the ideation and the fact that I had thought about it, but I had no intention of acting on it. And I didn't know how to even raise it as an issue then, because I felt like the conversation had just been completely shut down and any kind of discussion was just off the table. So yeah, I didn't talk about it for years and years and years. It was probably not until 6 years of personal development. I started a podcast in 2018 because I did for no reason other than I thought it would be fun, I did a public speaking course, and the thing that was the most challenging about it was talking about my kind of experiences with my mental health, and it was something that I'd never done publicly before. I've spoken to a couple of friends about depression. I think I've maybe spoken to one or two of my friends about suicide ideation, but in very hushed tones and like making a lot of excuses of like, oh, I've never acted on it, blah, blah, blah. Like it wasn't a big safe conversation or anything. It was just a kind of admission of guilt almost. But anyway, doing this course, I really enjoyed the public speaking, and I really enjoyed like getting the crowd engaged. I was talking about really lovely, fluffy topics like community engagement and social change and all these things that I'm super passionate about. But I just kind of looked at the TED Talks again for inspiration, and I thought, I'm not doing anything important with this platform. They're giving me an opportunity to talk to a room full of people and share a message, and I'm kind of wasting the opportunity. I feel like I could do something bigger. And no word of a lie, this happened to me a week before the presentation. I had a dream, a really vivid dream, that I was on a big boat, like a sailing boat, and I was navigating it, and the captain had just said to me, "This is your boat now, see you later." Jumped off the boat and left me with it, and all was fine for a while. But then suddenly there's a storm that rolled in, and the water got really, really like erratic and scary, and I got swept overboard. And I remember that it was one of those really visceral dreams where you like feel everything that's going on, which is horrifying. So I was like struggling for what felt like hours trying to get back to the boat, swimming back to the boat. And it kind of reached this point where I was like, right, I can either keep on struggling and try and get back to the boat, or I can just let go and drown, which I don't want to do, but like, which is worse? Rock in a hard place, right? And I woke up and I was like, well, if that's not a metaphor for suicide, I don't know what is. And if that's not a nudge to talk about suicide, I don't know what is. So that kind of formed the basis of my speech. I called it Dark Water, and I delivered it in front of a room full of people. There was like 100 people there, including my parents, who I'd never told this to before ever, and I was terrified. But yeah, that was the kind of start of it then. So that was going on like a year and a half, 2 years ago, maybe. Yeah, that was kind of what started everything. But it took me up until that point, from all the years of personal development and kind of therapy and everything else, to be able to stand up in front of a room full of people. So people say it to me now all the time, like, oh, you're really brave to talk about what you do. And I'm like, it was like a really long process. I didn't wake up one day and go, oh, this will be fun. Like, it took a long time to get there. And that's, I think that kind of intimidates people sometimes with mental health. And when we talk about it, they think, you know, there's a lot of pressure on talk about it. And yeah, there's an argument for that. And I do a lot of that in my teaching, my training and stuff. But also there's there's kind of like a misstep there. And the misstep is listening, and just listening to yourself and getting to know who you are and what's important to you. And just you don't need to talk to anybody else. It's almost like a self conversation, if you like. You have to kind of start having that conversation with yourself of like, what's upsetting me? Why is that upsetting me? And you know, I was just absorbing resources like a mad thing, reading a lot of books and watching TED Talks and stuff for a long, long time before I started expressing my feelings outwardly. It was all very internal and very quiet for a very, very long time. So yeah, it's something that I'd encourage other people to do as a first step. Do that bit of reflection and let the quiet come before vocalizing anything sometimes.
Yeah, that's good advice. Just to go inwards before you go outwards.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I'm linking this now, Alice, to what you were saying earlier about meaning and finding passion. Something, you know, in the workplace, there's a lot of people who aren't passionate about what they do at all. They're just there 9 to 5, going through the motions, and quite often that leads to depression and other mental health issues, and perhaps to suicidal ideation. So would you say that through the dark times that you've experienced, you've kind of connected with something that you feel is your purpose?
Yeah, definitely. It's we don't necessarily have to have just one purpose in our lives, and we don't have to have just one thing that we're passionate about. It's a real interesting thing. I haven't quite decided for myself whether it's a process of like becoming someone, like whether we're trying to reach for something and become a better version of ourselves, or whether it's more of an excavation of like rediscovering who we actually are at our core. I haven't quite decided which side of the fence I sit on with that. I think maybe it's a bit of a combination of the two. It's nature and nurture together. But yeah, I've got such a sense of purpose now, and weirdly, it's something that I think I always wanted. And that's one of the reasons that my mental health got as bad as it did, is because I felt so rudderless, and I felt so much like I wanted to achieve things, and not even achieve things. I just wanted a really meaningful life. I wanted to have a real reason for doing things I was doing, and I didn't have it for the longest time, but I was always searching for it. And that was a real source of stress for me. It was really upsetting because I just felt like I was capable, and I felt like I wanted to do so much good in the world and stuff. And I just didn't know where to start. I didn't know where to spend my time and stuff. And it sounds like such a first world problem. And that, again, that kind of fed into my guilt that I felt, because I came from, you know, an all right family. I always had a safe home. I had a stable upbringing and stuff. And a lot of the vernacular around mental health is like, oh, you need a really big reason. You need to have a reason for feeling so bad. You need validation. And I didn't have kind of anything too traumatic on the face of it, but my kind of trauma for me was in my lack of identity and purpose. That's a really big point of it. So yeah, I'm riddled with purpose now. It's not necessarily just attached to the work that I'm doing. It's just, it kind of runs through everything I do. Like I do things that I enjoy and that make me happy, and I realize in looking after myself, I can, you know, just show up for people better. And that goes for everything. It goes for all the relationships I have and everything I put my energy and my time into. I put my energy and my time into those things fully. And there's a real element of mindfulness and intention. I'd say I live with a lot of intention now, which I never used to do, especially when I was younger. If you told me what's your intention, don't know.
Yeah, that's lovely. And I sense that passion, I sense that energy within you, and just doing good and doing stuff that you enjoy that makes a difference to people's lives. So brilliant. And do you want to explain how that kind of evolved into Dark Coffee as it is today?
Yeah, so after I did the public talk, I decided, like, oh, this is a really good conversation. This is like, the feedback from it was so positive. People just like threw themselves at me after the talk, and everybody was hugging me and saying thank you for saying it. Some people said things like, I've seen the dark water too, I know exactly what you mean. And all these people I would never have expected to say it as well. I was overwhelmed, actually. And I just thought, I want to do something with this energy. I want to do something with this, because it struck a chord with so many people, and I can't just sit on this and not do anything with it. But I didn't really know where to start. And I was talking to one of my closest friends. We went to the pub, as you do, to celebrate. And I was telling him all the things I was thinking, and he was like, why don't you just do a podcast? Because we both listen to podcasts a lot, and it's something we spoke about all the time. And I was like, oh God, that's such an obvious idea. Yeah. So we came up with the name for the podcast there and then. And I went and did a little bit of research, like more research than I probably needed to do. I was like, how does one do a podcast? How do I do this? How do I do that? So took me a couple of weeks to get the whole thing together and launch, but yeah, then it launched, and it's not quite like the rest is history. But one of the problems I had very, very early on, again because of PR, it's really hard to get people to talk about suicide. It was really, really difficult. So as much as I wanted to jump in and talk about it all the time, quickly I realized I actually didn't want to just focus on suicide, because you can't talk about suicide without talking about the things that contribute to that. So existing mental health, society, pressure, structure, power systems, all these really interesting things that interplay on all of our lives and impact us in really interesting ways. You can't talk about one without all the others. So very quickly it became more than just a suicide awareness project. That's very much at the heart of it, but we kind of opened up the discussion to talk about all kinds of mental health. And I really started speaking from my own experience because of lack of options. So as much as I wanted to interview people and say, I want you to tell your suicide story and raise awareness and stuff, people would kind of agree in principle, but then I had a lot of people counselling, a lot of people going, actually, no, I don't feel comfortable and confident enough yet. And of course, I respected that completely. So I was like, in the interest of keeping it moving forward, I'll just need to draw my own experience. But I want to focus on solutions and social change and things. So I realized I don't just want to talk about suicide, I want to talk about more. So in talking about my own experiences, I started connecting with loads of other people who were interested in what I was doing. And now it's really cool. Like, it's come full circle, because now I have a waiting list of people who can't wait to come on the podcast, and they're like, I want to tell my story. I want to tell my story. So that's really cool. But I wanted to find a way that I could do it more often. So I was doing it as a hobby, obviously, on the side of my regular job. And so I started this Entrepreneur Accelerator program, which I'd heard about. So I did it. The company I was working for a friend of mine who's an entrepreneur. So I encouraged him to go on this scheme for his business. And at the very last minute, I'm talking about hours before the deadline, I was like, sod it, I'll just put my name in the hat, my hat in the ring. And I didn't qualify for it because Dark Coffee was a project and it was an idea, but this scheme was for companies, and it was for trading companies as well. So I didn't think I'd get it at all, but I managed to blag it and got onto it. And that was kind of the making of it, of seeing, actually, this could go beyond just being a podcast. It could actually be a company, and I could do more with it. So yeah, so I was on the scheme for a year in the end, because I managed to blag a second round, even though I still wasn't trading. But I went full time in September with the company, so I've been doing it ever since. And it's just been a weird and amazing learning journey. I've absolutely loved it, and it's still finding my feet, because I am a startup. But I've kind of, I think I've always known I wanted to work for myself. So it's been a real treat, and a bit of a huge learning curve, actually, because as much as you think you want something, we can't ever know what it's like until we try it. And a lot of the work that I do now is around kind of busting the myths around entrepreneurship, because I think it's very much held up as like the one correct way of living your life and the true route to freedom and all the rest of this kind of bullshit. And there's truth in it, but it's not the whole truth, and it's not going to be everybody's truth. So I do a lot of kind of awareness and a lot of events around like, what is entrepreneurship? Is it good? And I do a lot of kind of, let's talk about the good and the bad together. It's that kind of, like you said, there's good in the bad always. So I like to think of how can we catalyze these bad times and these dark subjects, talk about them, but then move it towards, you know, get something positive out of it and look at the two together. And we're not saying, you know, we're not going to have any bad times. It's not to shame our bad experiences or anything like that, but it's how can we use them and utilize them for our personal growth. And yeah, that's kind of why I do what I do now. So it's expanded. It's still a work in progress, trying to figure out like what Dark Coffee is, but for the most part we say it's mental health and wellbeing training, and we're a consultancy, so it comes in lots of different forms. I do public speaking and kind of inspirational talks, TED style, but I really like doing workshops and just talking to people one-on-one and working with them to kind of open up these conversations that I call it unfiltered, having unfiltered conversations around mental health to get people talking and get people just like normalize it. I want mental health conversations to be as normal as your cup of coffee in the morning. I want it to just be so mundane that people look back in 10 years and go, oh, did they ever used to not look after their mental health as like part of their daily routine? How very bizarre. I want it to just be so workaday and mundane. So yeah, that's what I'm pushing towards. So I'm getting really into events recently because I just think that something very special about getting people in a room and just giving them free rein to be themselves and express themselves. As you'll know from doing these things, it's really powerful.
It is, and it's a lovely invitation. You know, I think when someone makes themselves vulnerable and talks about what's really going on for them, it's a lovely invitation for someone else to do the same. And like you said earlier, go inwards. Yeah, is crucial. So yeah, that morning cup of coffee, that dark, unfiltered water. I like it. So I believe you're currently you're making a documentary about suicide prevention at the moment.
Yeah, God, that's an ongoing project, to be honest. That's a bit of a sore point. But we started it last October or something, last September, that kind of time. So really interesting project. A friend of mine who's a videographer approached me about it, and he said, look, I'm really interested in what you're doing, and it's just so interesting to me. So I really want to talk more about suicide and more to the point, suicide prevention. Like, how can we step in earlier and help people to not get that far down the suicide ideation line? How can we start to reel it back? So we went and spoke to some people. So we've got some academics in there from different kind of vantage points. One guy talks more about the social aspects of like why society makes us suicidal effectively, and we had another lady who speaks from she worked in mental health nursing for years and years, so she was talking about her experiences in the 70s when people were still going to asylums and stuff, and how nursing has changed and the medical model of mental health has changed a lot over the years. So we've spoken to some really interesting people. I think the last time we actually went back to editing and chopping it up and stuff was January, just because he's on different projects, I'm on my own projects, and this is very much like a passion project that we're doing in between. So unfortunately it's something that's been sidelined for a long time, but actually I am talking to him tomorrow to have a catch up and stuff, so it might be back on. But this is kind of a bit of a notorious thing with documentary films, is that they take so long because you have so many interesting conversations with people, and you start off thinking it's straightforward and like, this is the story we're going to tell, and then it can completely derail and go off in a different direction. But it's been really fascinating, and the conversations I've had, it's just so interesting to hear from all these people with all these different viewpoints, but there are some very strong connecting threads. And one of the things that keeps coming up is just this idea that as humans we all just want to be understood. We want to feel seen and heard and loved for who we are, and that kind of idea of authenticity is something that runs through all the work I do with Dark Coffee and everything I try and do in the community. It's just the kind of question behind it is like, what if we were actually who we are and not who we think we need to be? What would our lives be like if we actually got back to that truth about ourselves? And I think honestly we'd all be happier. I think that's the root of happiness and true fulfillment, is just being who you actually are and being really proud of it and doing the best with whatever you've been given, whatever your skill set is.
Yeah, and being accepted for being
Yeah.
there as well.
Yeah.
Seen. Lovely, that's great. So, summing up, if there's somebody watching or someone who knows someone who's watching who's having suicidal ideation, or is even further down the continuum than that, what sort of words would you say to them, words of wisdom?
I say don't panic. You're completely normal, even though it feels like sometimes it's a very isolating experience, but it's really not. There are so many people that go through that and are at different stages, have come out the other side. So just because you're feeling this way in this moment, or you have done for a while, irrespective of how long you've been feeling like this and stuff, just know that it doesn't have to be a forever situation. None of us were born feeling suicidal, so it is completely manageable, and it is completely possible to come back out of it. But I'd really encourage people not to feel ashamed of it. There will be so many people that understand what you're going through, and there's so many organizations that purely their remit is to help people who are feeling suicidal, and just to express yourself fully and openly, and to be understood and have that platform to speak openly. I know Samaritans are my recommended route, because they're just, I know quite a bit about the training that they undergo, and they are so compassionate. They're wonderful, wonderful people, absolutely incredible, and they will listen and they won't judge you. They're always available. And yeah, it's a process. I'm not going to say like, oh, you could just click your fingers and not be suicidal overnight, but it is definitely something that you can learn to manage 100%. And we're more capable than we give ourselves credit for. If you look at this moment in time where we are today, every single one of us has got through 100% of the barriers that have been placed in front of us. 100% of us have got through 100% of the difficulties, the traumas, the things that we thought would kill us, the things that we thought would break our spirits completely. You've survived everything up until this point, and that's because we all have so many capabilities within us. We just need to learn how to do that. We just need the right people to help us. We need the right resources to help us. So yeah, it's just a case of starting that line of self-inquiry. And if you don't feel confident and comfortable talking to someone else, I would say at the point of crisis, if you feel like you were going to act on it, I'd encourage you to seek professional conversations for sure. But up until that point, if you're in the ideation phase, I just encourage that kind of self-inquiry piece. Just start looking around, start looking at so much free content online. Honestly, TED Talks are a great starting point. But read people's biographies. You'd be amazed how many people have moved through feelings of suicide. And so many celebrities and people that we really revere now that are at the top of their professional fields. Like, it's happened to the best of us. It really has. So yeah, I'd just like to encourage you to approach it with curiosity, and try not to make yourself feel any worse. You don't need any kind of guilt or shame added into the mix as well. I'd say try and act with a bit of compassion towards yourself and a bit of understanding.
Yeah, exactly. So going inwards with compassion, out for all the support that's out there. And yeah, I suppose everything you've said there, Alice, is really applicable to all mental health issues.
Absolutely.
Anything, there is always hope, and there's always support out there as well.
Yeah.
Lovely. So is there anything else that you want to bring, anything that we haven't covered that you'd like to say before we
I just kind of like to make a kind of broader point about mental health, because again, it's that perception piece of like how people talk about it and how people perceive it. Mental health isn't something to be scared about. It's just we all have a brain in our heads, and therefore we all have challenges to come across. And for me, mental health is about how you just manage the everyday stresses of life and how happy and comfortable you feel in yourself. So it's more to do with your social support systems and your emotional support systems, and how comfortable you feel expressing yourself, and how much that's kind of validated by other people. Like we said earlier, like connection is so important. Human connection is what we all thrive off of, whether we realize it or not. So I'd say I'd love people to get curious about mental health, and every time they see that phrase, rather than running away, maybe run towards it a little bit, because we could all do with if we all worked on things like resilience and confidence, we'd all feel a lot happier and more comfortable with ourselves. But again, I think a bit of a challenge with the mental health brigade is that it tends to be overly clinical, and kind of we talk about illnesses and conditions and stuff like that. And really, mental health is a very holistic thing. It's about wellbeing. That's why I normally say we're a wellbeing consultancy. But if I walk into a room and say that, people think I sell herbs and stuff, but it's a very broad term. It encompasses a lot of things. So I think this is a really good time, like while we're all dealing with the stresses of the COVID situation, it is a good opportunity to think about our health and to prioritize it in a way that we haven't done that before. And I hope we will do the same with our relationships as well. It's a real time to think about what is important to you right now. And just one little hack that I found really helpful lately is whenever I'm doing something, I'll catch myself every now and then, and I'll just ask myself the question, is this helpful or is this harmful? So particularly with things like eating habits, like everybody's in the fridge 24/7 at the moment, it can be really detrimental to us. And it's not saying it's a good or a bad thing. Like, I think we need to get away from these binaries. But if you ask yourself a question in a moment of, is this action helpful or is it harmful? And whichever side of the argument is more, it's probably elements of both. But if it's more harmful than helpful, maybe move away from those kind of habits. That's just good kind of, it's like a temperature check, basically, that you can do quite easily to try and gauge where you're at in any one moment and to try and redirect yourself on a slightly better path. And just as a general rule of like how I live my day-to-day life, I don't try and be perfect ever. Like, I don't think I've ever tried to even approach perfect for about 20 years. But one thing I do try and aim towards is just a 1% adjustment. I just try and it's a theory called marginal gains theory. I don't know if you've heard of it, but it's the idea that a 1% improvement done consistently over time leads, it's like compound interest. Like it goes nowhere for ages, and then it suddenly goes up, like the corona peak actually, and it suddenly spikes. And that's a really good way of like managing your time and living your life, really, because it's not aiming for perfection. It's not giving yourself ridiculously high standards to achieve. It's not telling yourself, I'm going to learn French when I'm in lockdown. It's just, if we all live every day and just try and make little decisions, little tweaks, little adjustments here and there, that's a really good way of just feeling like we're always moving forward, because this is very much a time when people feel a bit claustrophobic. Maybe they feel a bit trapped, stagnant. People feel a bit stuck and a bit low. There are all these things going on, and the energy feels very stagnant. It's really nice to learn how to sit with yourself in those moments and how to be still, and like you said earlier, to go inwards. But then also, in order to progress and to keep that momentum going, we don't need to be running before we can walk. We just need to make these tiny little actions, but aim to do it consistently. Just try and get yourself to do one thing every day that's a little bit better, you know, make that one decision that's not a cake after dinner. Maybe it's, you know, cutting back on sugar, whatever it is, only having 1 coffee a day instead of 4, whatever it is, just tiny adjustments. You'd be overwhelmed at the difference it can make to your happiness, your emotions, and your well-being, and everything, your relationships, everything.
That's really great hacks there, Alice. Thank you. So I suppose I'll summarize that as having mindful awareness of your behaviors, your habits, your thoughts, and having compassion for yourself.
Definitely.
For perfection, or like you say, learning a new language whilst we're in lockdown, and then coming up with perhaps some more positive coping strategies, or so maybe just having a little portfolio of things that you can do. Need to go inwards, help you, the more positive than negative on the well-being scale. So mindfulness, I'm all hanging on about that type of stuff.
But also, and what works for one person isn't going to work for someone else. Just because everybody else in your network is doing 10 hours of meditation doesn't mean it's going to work for you ever. Like, I don't consider myself a meditator at all, but my method of kind of self-reflection and quiet is journaling. That's one of my go-tos. So again, it's worth just dabbling in these things. Just view it as, you know, if you Google any of these topics we've spoken about today, mental health, awareness, self-management techniques, self-care, mindfulness, any of these things, if you Google it, you'll get 100 different ways you can look after yourself. Mindfulness especially, there's so many things you can do to be mindful, and little kind of games that you can play. Almost, it's almost like I Spy. Like, you can look for how many types of green can you see when you're out on your walk, and you just pay more attention to the trees and the things that you go past. So yeah, if you Google any one of those terms, you'll come up with 100 different things. So don't think just because you haven't meditated today, you failed at life. It's really not. It's not that straightforward. And what works for you at different times in your life and different cycles will not necessarily work for where you're at this moment in time today, right here, right now. So it's good to just explore. And one thing I learned that's really helpful for me is not to think of progress as linear. It's very much, our energy levels and the way that we operate, especially women, our energy levels operate in cycles. It's almost like seasons. So in the same way that we have to go through, spring and summer, and then we always get to autumn and winter. Variations on the seasons year by year, I think you'd agree. But it always comes in these big cycles, and our energy level and the way that we operate as animals is exactly the same. So just because you're getting up today and you're doing all the things and you feel great, doesn't mean tomorrow's going to be the same. And we can't judge ourselves for that, and we can't be like, oh God, I did all my work yesterday, I was so productive, and then I failed today. And it goes back to what you said at the beginning, like, were there particular triggers for you, or was it just a random thing? Sometimes it will feel like this bad mood has just completely come out of nowhere and knocked me for six, and we'll make ourselves feel bad for that because we'll think, oh, I think I was doing everything right. But there's an element of just, we need to just allow ourselves to be weird and for our moods to do things that we don't expect. We can't control everything down to the finite detail. We just can't, because our bodies are very weird, and there's a lot of very complex stuff going on within our bodies, and as much as we might want to try and contain it and control it, it's a bit of an illusion. We're just all doing the best we can, but our bodies will do weird things without our say so, and we'll be influenced by the people and the environment around us. And like the fact that we're all still functioning and getting up and putting clothes on every day is amazing sometimes, because you look at the world and how much information we're all exposed to, and it's like, wow, we're doing really well collectively. I think well done to all of us for getting on and adapting. Like how amazing are humans for adapting as much as we do.
Big pats on the back for all of us for our resilience. And yeah, totally get in there about the seasonality of energy and stuff like that.
Yeah.
I remember the psychotherapy session I had back in November, I think it was, last year, and I just couldn't get going. I couldn't finish my essay, and the psychotherapist said, right, it's basically winter. The days are getting shorter. It's darker. You're meant to be hibernating, so just allow yourself to hibernate, and that's okay.
Yeah, it's so true. And a lot of us are having to feel that now, because if you look at the amount of pressure and amount of stress that we're all under, a lot of us, if we're still going to work and we're still trying to get stuff done and we're still trying to be as productive as a usual day, but you look at all the headwinds that are kind of acting against us and all the forces that are acting against us, you're not going to get as much done because you're having to fight that much harder to get through all those barriers again. So it's about recognizing things as they truly are, kind of taking a step back from it and seeing the perspective of it, of like, okay, I could try and be super productive, I could try and force myself through all these barriers, but there's a caveat to that. And if I use extra energy trying to break down these barriers, it's going to affect me. I'm not just an endless reserve of energy. I need to do something to rest. I need to recuperate. I need to come back fighting and recharge, and then I can carry on. We can't just think we can just keep going and keep going and keep going. It's a myth and it's a lie, and it's something we've never been able to do as humans. The Industrial Revolution would have us believe that we should be working 12 hours in a factory, but we know better than that now. We've got more knowledge around it. So we just need to let ourselves be a little bit more human sometimes, and learn to be okay with it.
Yeah. So there you are, folks. If you find yourself in choppy waters trying to swim after a fast receding yacht, roll onto your back for a while, have a rest and save some energy.
That's a really great way of looking at it. I love that.
Rather than sinking down to the bottom.
Yeah, that's the other option. Don't fight, just relax and rest a while. Yeah, I love that, Paul. Smashing.
Great. So I've really enjoyed that, Alice. Thank you very much.
Thank you. You enjoyed our chat about suicide. There we go. Just proves it. It can be done.
Good talk. So, thank you very much, Alice, for your time and your expertise and sharing your personal story as well as your badass hippie. Which is very inspiring.
Thanks for having me. I hope people enjoyed it. But if anyone wants to connect with me on LinkedIn, that's normally where I hang out. So that's probably the best way to find me.
Yeah, so there's the details if you want to find Alice on the website and Instagram. So there we go. Hope you enjoyed that, folks. So yeah, thank you, Alice. I'm going to do a kind of do a bit of blurb and then play a song. So feel free to disappear if you've got nothing better to do.
Thank you so much, Paul. Have a good night.
Thank you very much, Alice. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Well, wasn't that super? Really inspiring, and I hope that has broken a bit of stigma for you if you find the idea of suicide in any way difficult. It is good to talk. And yeah, as I said, 1 in 5 people, according to statistics, have suicidal ideation at some point. So it's not as rare as you might think, not as you might imagine. Okay, so I'm going to play a song, but first of all, it's one of your favourite songs, Timmy. First of all, I'll just let you know what is happening tomorrow. So tomorrow we've got Sarah Louise Burton coming in. She is a yoga teacher and author and all-round wellbeing champion. She's going to be talking about gratitude. She's the founder of the Gratitude Program. She's also going to be talking about faith and what does that mean to her? What does that mean to us in these tricky times and in general? And also Kundalini. We'll probably be talking about Kundalini yoga, but I'm going to talk about what the Kundalini awakening is as well. If she wants to go out. Saturday, we've got Marcus coming back in to do a hypnotherapy session on Zoom. So we want you to come along. And we're going to do a live demo. He's going to do a live demo. So if you'd like to volunteer, that'd be great. It means I won't have to do it. And keep sharing the group. Connect with Alice if you'd like to do so. Keep sharing the group. If you know anyone who would benefit from what goes on here, bring them in. And in the meantime, I shall play this song by Hello Operator, which I think I've probably played before, but I'm getting to that stage now where I'm starting to repeat stuff. But that's okay, because I think last time the sound quality wasn't great, so hopefully it'll be a bit better this time.
Keep me calm and hold me like a trap. Keep me coming in the morning, on the night. I'm always on the run. Sold and sold to the devil and ran a mile, or so they say so. Tell me, baby, where you hiding? Tell me, maybe the evil's that I love. When she's walking down the street, her footsteps sing. Stephanie's coming. I like the way you move. I like the way you move. I like the way you move. Show me down and wrap me around to pick me up and kick me on the ground. Steal the jewels, rational mind and feel a fool's and still a firefly. Cause I don't know where the wind blows. Keep me calm and hold me like a sky. Came and coming in the morning, on the night, the devil's in disguise. When she woke up from a dream, the blood-stained bill. Stephanie's coming. I like the way you move. 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 Stephanie's coming.
Why would you burn a guitar? What a waste. Okay, folks. So, yeah, enjoy the rest of your Thursday. Hopefully, see you tomorrow for celebrating talking about faith and gratitude and a bit of Kundalini yoga for stuff. See you soon. Take care.